X2 X-Men United, which is going to be the next movie that we talked about. The development of this sequel began shortly after that first film was released in 2000, and David Hayter and Zach Penn were hired to write separate scripts. So they were going to put together two different scripts, and ultimately they were going to take the two scripts that they wrote together and then combine them and pull out the best elements of both scripts into one screenplay. Now I know that this has happened before. I don't really hear about this anymore. Like we don't really get stories about like, oh yeah, there's two screenwriters and they're just gonna like tackle it, simultaneously, and they were just gonna pull out the best elements of both. Like this is somewhat experimental, but it also kind of feels somewhat problematic at the same time. I don't know. Like we hear about rewrites, obviously. We hear about people coming on to help punch up certain lines, certain elements, maybe take a look at the third act and try to rewrite that. But to make the choice from the get-go to say, like, we're going to write two separate scripts and then just come back and try to get the best of both worlds into one. I don't know. I don't know if it was just due to the nature of this being a really, really big franchise and there being a ton of studio pressure to try to make the best movie possible. But clearly, I guess it didn't really affect the film's quality because a lot of people do love this movie. And it ultimately turned out to be something that people kind of revered once it came out.
Yeah, I don't know if they got lucky or,
maybe that's it. Just fucking luck out of nowhere. Like, damn,
or
I'm
how
surprised
this
this
went
worked.
down. Or maybe like their post process of bringing the scripts together were just really good, like they storyboarded well together or something, you know what I mean? Like I'm trying to figure out too how they did this. I've seen movies get stolen and the two of the same movies comes out, right? No Strings Attached slash what's the other one? No Strings Attached.
Friends with Benefits.
Friends with Benefits.
Yeah.
That's a thing. But like I've never seen like, hey guys, write two separate scripts and yeah, we're going to use the best from both. Like it almost feels like a middle school project that has happened before. I feel like I've seen that happen before, but I just feel like they might have gotten lucky or they had a good process post writing it. Like this seems like really crazy to me. I don't know how they did it.
Yeah. It's just a crazy thing, but I think what it ultimately ended up doing, at least in the long run, and I think what made these movies ultimately suffer, there just became too many cooks in the kitchen. Like we just got to a point where there were just so many visions, so many thoughts about the direction of just like the story. Like it just got too convoluted very, very quickly. I think that reared its head by the third one. The film's premise was influenced by the storylines from Marvel, Return of Weapon X and God Loves, Man Kills. Rewrites were commissioned again to give Halle Berry more screen time, and that was because she had just won an Oscar and got a lot of new popularity from that Oscar win in Monsters Ball. She won that No. 1. She also made a James Bond movie, Die Another Day, in 2002. She was like the co-lead with Pierce Brosnan. Not a great movie by any stretch, but was hugely popular, made a lot of money at the box office. And then again, another budget cut meant that the Danger Room was once again cut out of the script, as well as Sentinels that were included there as well. So the Danger Room is always like the first thing to go.
Crazy.
Like, we're getting rid of the
What are we doing?
I guess that's super expensive. I mean, I don't know. I might be, caping for them too much, but the Danger Room sequence in the third one to open up the last stand, it's pretty badass. It's dope. It's a dope scene.
That's what I'm saying. It's a good scene.
But it looked like it cost a lot of fucking money to make at the same time. It looked like that would
they could have made a cheap version. Like maybe we don't need
we don't want
the
that.
whole shoot some robots in the Danger Room.
No,
you know what I'm saying?
We don't,
like, pew, pew.
It has to be bombastic. It has to be huge. If it wasn't, people would have been pissed that they fucking shortchanged.
The Sentinel looked crazy in that movie, but we'll talk about it later.
Yeah. No, for sure. But that Danger Room, man, it just always it's on the cutting room floor.
Damn Danger Room.
But by this point, they primarily had filming for this movie take place in Vancouver. This is interesting because I don't know if a lot of people know this, but they filmed X2 and X3 in Vancouver primarily. Most of the CW shows, like Arrow and The Flash and all those, they were filming in Vancouver. They would reuse a lot of the sets that were already being used for this movie. Like,
wow,
the X Mansion was Arrow's mansion in those first few seasons of the Arrow show, and they used a couple of other sets that were created. I think the set that's at the end of this movie that's near the dam, they used for one of those shows. It might have been Legends of Tomorrow or The Flash. I can't remember exactly, but they used a lot of these same locations once again because all of those CW superhero DC shows were filming in Vancouver. And so just, again, kind of a not really full circle, but there's interesting ties there, obviously, just due to the nature of their source material. 64 sets were used in 38 different locations. This was a massive, massive production. Sets aren't as much of a thing anymore in big budget movies, though,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like we talk
Yeah.
about things like the volume. Like, what the fuck is the volume? Like, we're not building sets anymore. Like, the volume. Like, that's the thing we talk about. And don't get me wrong, like, sometimes it looks really great. I love the volume and how it's utilized in the Batman. You know, that looks amazing. But they also use like a lot of real locations in the Batman. They filmed in Scotland. But that's just interesting. You have any thoughts about that? Just like they used to really build sets. I remember like even young, like being younger, those Scooby-Doo movies, the live action ones. I
Mm-hmm.
remember watching like behind the scenes stuff, and they would always talk about like all the sets that they had to build to really build out
Mm-hmm.
all of the different places that they would be. But this is becoming increasingly more of a rarity, I think, in Hollywood. Just like the active building of these sets and these different tactile places to make it all feel as real as possible.
Man, I love Scooby Doo. Yeah, it's part of me. I don't know, man. It's just so weird how that's slowly not becoming as much as a thing anymore. And of course, it all feels tied to money, right? But also like intentionality and what some people want these movies to look like. And I feel like when we hear about a film, they're like, yeah, I built this set and this set. Usually those are like the production design movies we love. You know what I'm saying? Like those are usually like the ones it's like, oh man, that movie that looked crazy. And so it has just felt like maybe there was less to pump out back then. You know what I mean? Okay, we could put our energy here. We could do this. People used to be more meticulous about things. We just don't get it as much, and it's unfortunate. But I also like that concept of using things. I feel like we've seen that all the time. I've seen sitcoms that I can tell. I'm like, that's the same damn house. Y'all not gonna change the house in the sitcom. Y'all just gonna keep the same house. But I do like that because people put a lot of work into making some of these cool sets and production pieces and all of this. It's like, damn, we're just gonna tear it down. And then there goes all the money that we just used in there. Like part of me is like repurpose some of these things, which again, like you said, has happened, but I feel like it doesn't happen enough. And so I think that's a really interesting fact, and it needs to happen, I think, more often for sure. But man, we got to get back to building some of these sets, man, because it definitely shows in the movie. And again, it tends to be a lot of times the better production designs that we love and remember is like a set that had to be built, that they had to shoot. Because then because sometimes you go to the volume, you're like, forgettable, or like, you know what I mean, you don't remember what the background looked like, you don't remember what this piece over here looked like versus this piece. It's just, yeah, it's really interesting.
It just doesn't feel as artistic. It doesn't feel
Yeah.
as much of the creative spirit that I think we associate with movie making and just the
Mm-hmm.
art of making films. Like as a young guy, as a young kid, I used to consume that stuff all the time, the behind the scenes featurettes, to just like see like how did
Mm-hmm.
they bring this stuff to life. And I remember those Lord of the Rings DVDs, those Pirates of the Caribbean DVDs, you know, movies like Spider-Man and X-Men, like all of these behind the scenes features that would really just highlight all the work that went into the stuff, and the fact that these things look so good that they don't even feel like sets. You're not even actively thinking about that this is a
Exactly.
set. It looks like a real place, and that's the art of it,
Mm-hmm.
to not make you think that it is a set. But now there's less emphasis on the making of movies. Like we just don't actively talk about that stuff anymore. Obviously, physical media is a huge part of that because people aren't buying physical media anymore to learn about how the movie was made. We're just watching it
Mm-hmm.
and moving on to the next thing. And it's only like a few directors that really still cherish that stuff these days. And when we do talk about it, they're like the shining example. They're
Exactly.
the exception to the rule, as opposed to it just being a commonplace occurrence
Mm-hmm.
as it used to be back in the day. But when you look at this movie, you can tell like, oh yeah, that White House set that they had in the beginning
Yeah,
of the movie, it's incredible. The stuff that they had
it
at the
is.
end with the dam and everything with Lady Deathstrike and Wolverine and where they fought, like that stuff is incredible. X Mansion again, which is like a real place that they use, but they obviously had to you know, make it up and set dress it and do all these extra different things. Like they're iconic pieces of the film, you know. And I love that point you made about repurposing too. I don't know how many films I've seen the Michael Keaton Wayne Manor in. That Wayne Manor has been in so many damn movies. I know it was in The Mummy
Yes.
Returns.
Yep.
I think there's like a video on YouTube on Architectural Digest, I believe it was. They talk about the different Wayne Manors in all the movies. And I believe that when he goes through, you know, the one that's in the Michael Keaton, Tim Burton films, they talk about the other films that it's been in. It's just like stuff like that. You grow to have an association with those things. But we might be just sounding really, really nerdy right now. But you know, with the story, the idea to have Jean Grey sacrifice herself at the end and to be resurrected in the third installment was highly secretive. And Bryan Singer, he didn't even tell Famke Jensen until midway through filming that this was going to be the case. This also seems like an odd occurrence. Now we hear about secrecy all the time with movies. We hear about
Mm-hmm.
secrecy with Marvel films on a regular basis. You know, we hear about the
Mm-hmm.
actors not getting the script to Infinity War and Endgame. Like only Robert Downey Jr. had the entire script to Endgame. No other cast member had it. They just got their scenes. But here, like that was kind of a strange thing. Like, wait, what? Like the actor's not going to get the script to the movie, but this was like a big reveal at that time. Like the
Yeah.
fact that she was going to eventually have the Phoenix, I guess a version of the Phoenix Force. I don't even know if I
Right.
can call it that really, but you know, they were going to try to adapt that story in some respect. How do you feel about just the fact that that was like a thing, the secrecy behind this, and they were trying to really hold on to this reveal until people saw it in theaters?
Yeah, this is one of I think the few times where again we're making history with these movies, and so a lot of the other popular movies before this didn't have a ton of source material. There wasn't anything to really hide. You know what I mean? Yo, I can't hide this from you. You can't hide this from me. But at the time, you bet you believe there's a ton of nerds going to see this movie who know exactly what the hell the Phoenix is and what the Phoenix is capable of and what that means for the future of X-Men. And so I love that idea. Again, eventually Marvel found, I think, the power in being secretive. They did find the ways in which to manipulate that idea of people not knowing, shoot, the actors not knowing, and especially the audience not knowing. But it's really cool to think about this time. It's like, oh yeah, there wasn't like a ton of that going on at that time. And so I just think it's really cool. In I hope like people remember it as that though too. I hope like we can constantly remember like, man, that wasn't a thing back then. Like now people are going to remember watch this and be like, huh, that's a big reveal. That's a big surprise. And so yeah, I'm hoping they can continue to do that, which they have. Marvel has continued to do that, but I hope we don't lose kind of the art of that, because I think it holds value, and this was one of the first times I think we seen it hold that value.
Yeah. Also, you know, the internet is a thing now. Social media is a thing. You know, the privacy of these productions has dramatically decreased. We know everything about every movie now. We know about all the makings, all the cameos, all the surprises. Like nothing is a secret anymore. So the secrecy
Mm-hmm.
now that productions and studios have, it's mandatory. That just has to be a regular part of the practice. Whereas back then, that was just a luxury. That was a luxury to say like, I have a really big reveal, and I'm not going to tell my actor that that's going to happen. You can
Mm-hmm.
get away with that back then because all we had was like chat rooms that, you know, only a few people had. But now
Right.
you can't get away with stuff like that. If you go anywhere outside and see something filming, if you decide to move away from a set and go out in the real world, people are going to get it on photo. We see it with Deadpool and Wolverine. All the photos of their
Mm-hmm.
costumes popped up immediately as soon as we saw that they were out in the real world filming. So, just the evolution of everything and technology obviously necessitated that secrecy became a big priority. So according to Alan Cumming, who plays Nightcrawler in this movie, at some point during the filming, Bryan Singer, the director, he began berating the cast, which ultimately led to Halle Berry telling Bryan Singer, quote, "You can kiss my black ass," end quote. Alan Cumming would also later say that working on the film was a bad experience for him, which I feel like it kind of tracks because he doesn't come back for the third one. We don't ever see him reprise his role. He goes on to do other things. And I like Alan Cumming. He feels like a good actor. But I guess we should talk about Bryan Singer and just like his place in all of this because
Mm-hmm.
complicated figure, directed these first two films to huge success, even more so with this one, X2. It goes on to be a big success, makes a lot more money, becomes a lot more critically revered. But even during this time period, things about him were starting to come out. Stories about him were starting to come out and his movements in Hollywood. And there were a lot of accusations against him about sexual assault, manipulation, his tendency to potentially groom younger men, younger actors, his drug
Mm-hmm.
use, his tantrums on movie sets, his outbursts that he would have, his showing up late to set in unprofessionalism. But nothing really happened to him at all during these years. I mean, he would leave this franchise, go on to direct Superman Returns from Warner Brothers in 2006, which is why he didn't return for The Last Stand, would make more movies, and then ultimately return to this franchise. He came back and directed Days of Future Past and Apocalypse in the mid 2010s. It's not until the Me Too movement of 2017 where a lot of those older accusations resurfaced, new accusations about him came out. And it was
Mm-hmm.
finally at that moment, which was simultaneously happening while he was directing Bohemian Rhapsody, funny enough, that people
Crazy.
started to have an awareness of not only him, but just all of the nasty, predatory behavior that was happening in Hollywood. And so, I don't know, man. How do you reckon with this? Like, it's not even just him because like Brett Ratner, who we've already referenced, who we have to talk about again with The
Mm-hmm.
Last Stand, has sexual
Yep.
assault allegations. Joss Whedon has been painted to be an asshole in the industry and not a great guy, and his treatment of women is not great. And these guys are all orbiting each other at this exact same time. But first and foremost, Bryan Singer, who is one of the most successful directors that we've ever seen, there's no
Yeah.
taking that away from him,
Mm-hmm.
was apparently allegedly behind the scenes doing just a lot of terrible shit, and so it's a conversation of this guy being a visionary and being a very capable filmmaker and making something that a lot of people do love and adore and still talk about to this day, but the underbelly of it all is something that feels really really sinister and really ugly when you start to unpack it.
Yeah, we've been dealing with this so much, and we're still, constantly, I think, healing, from this, given the Me Too movement. We are in the era of still of Me Too, or we're still in the era of calling out the predators and the sexual assaulters and the assholes and the Dan Schneiders of the world, and we're still in the process of doing all these things. And so it's always so frustrating to know that, like, there's this art that you appreciate, but the person that made it is terrible. It's such a bad person. It's just constantly and continuously happening, and Bryan Singer is a very big example of that. And yeah, it's just it's constantly something I think we have to sit with and think about, and come to terms with, and eventually continue to give grace to everybody affected, at that time as well too. Like, that's this I remember, it was an article. It was like, what's his name, Blake Stewerman. I remember reading that article. It was like Blake Stewerman, who was like with Bryan Singer for a while. It was like crazy stories about, he had to make sure the dude was 18, looked at his ID at 18. It was just like, what are we doing here? It's too much, and how toxic all of that can be, man. And you know, eventually, I think there is a little bit of light in knowing some of these people aren't in power no more. Knowing Bryan Singer did get called out eventually, like you said, during Bohemian Rhapsody, around that time / Me Too, there is a little bit of comfort in that. But this who he is will always kind of be a part of the history, and part of the history of these films that we love. Again, it may be beloved movies, but we always got to, I think, remember this part of the history too. We can't forget it. We shouldn't forget it. And we always gotta take the good, the bad with the good. And I think as long as we continue to have these conversations like we're having right now, we remember that, as hurtful as they might be, I think it's all part of the healing process of what all this is.
I just find it crazy how long he was enabled and allowed to just be the way that he was. But
White man.
that's the problem, is that obviously he has that privilege of being a white man in Hollywood and having a lot of support and backers, but he was also in some respects a brilliant, talented
He's
individual.
good.
He was good.
He's good.
And I
Mhm.
think that we see the culture countless times over and over, these talented individuals who just get forgiven, and they just get sort of a tap on the shoulder, and they're enabled, and their behavior only festers and turns them really into monsters, because Dan Schneider is talented at his job at cultivating young talent and producing all of these
Mhm.
shows. And Kevin Spacey was one of the most talented actors of his generation. And Bryan Singer, extremely visionary director, and that was just a time where we just were not actively reckoning with the bullshit behavior behind the scenes, as
Mhm.
much as we should have been, because a lot of people got hurt along the way, which should never happen. I'm glad that ultimately a lot of this stuff came out, and that people got a chance to tell these stories. It is too little too late in some respects because people were hurt,
Mhm.
but
Right.
we do know the proper context now for a lot of this stuff. And for me, when you hear something so many times, like I'm calling it true. Like, of course, things have to be alleged because nothing has been proven in court, but the proof is in the pudding. If
Exactly.
you could put the lipstick on a pig, and what is it still? It's still gonna be a pig, and that's kind of how I see it. But I think it's just it's an active, conversation that we do continue to have. But even at this time, there's stories about how Kevin Feige was sent to the set of the first X-Men to keep Bryan Singer in check. Like, that
That's
was his
crazy.
role at that young age as an associate producer, still making a name and having to stand up to a director who had already sort of forged a name for himself in Hollywood. Bryan Singer had been working for nearly a decade at that point already, so he was well known. And then he would go on to make some huge successes out of this franchise. But Kevin Feige even being a focal point at that particular time and helping get the shit across the finish line, really honing in those filmmaking chops that he would have to actively use many times throughout his career, as we would know. It all is for hopefully something greater, is what you would hope, but it should never be at the expense of people's behavior, their safety, all of these things that we actively talk about. But turns out Bryan Singer's not a great guy. That's really what it boils down to. He's just not a great guy, but that is what it is at this point. But be that as it may, the film was still super successful. As I said, it ultimately made $407 million at the worldwide box office. So it just did gangbusters. It did even better. This was like a huge success at the box office, even when it came out, because its domestic opening was $85.6 million, one of the biggest domestic openings of all time at that particular point. Critics loved it. It had an 85% score on Rotten Tomatoes. Audiences gave it an A on Cinema Score. And even Empire Magazine at that time, they called X2 the best comic book movie of all time in 2006. It was a much thinner field of competition at that point in time. So I think it held up probably in 2006. Can you think of, I guess, to your thoughts, like, can you think of a comic book movie that you would probably place above it in 06? Because we didn't have the MCU. We didn't have Avengers films at that point yet. Not even
Spider-Man
the Dark Knight,
2.
now that I think about it, too.
Spider-Man 2, probably. I think I still,
because that came out in 04. Yeah. 100%.
I really liked Spider-Man 2. Like, that was like, I think I was like, Mom, I gotta go see this again. I don't think I went with her the second time, but I was like, Mom, I need to go see it. So that's probably like the one that I can think of at that time. Like you said, the landscape wasn't crazy. We didn't have a ton, but I think I liked Spider-Man 2 a little bit more than X2 at the time.
Oh, it's
1,000%
better.
It's a better movie for sure.
It's yeah.
But that might be the only one. Like, X2 might be 2 at that time. You know what I mean? Might go Spider-Man 2, X2. I think that was the order at the time. It wasn't much, like you said. So yeah, I think it was there.
Yeah, I think you would only have really an argument. Like, certain people would only have an argument if they grew up in the era of Christopher Reeve's Superman. Like, if that was
right,
that's
a good answer.
Yeah, of course, absolutely. I would never
Mm-hmm.
argue that, especially if that was like your hero. Like, if you grew up in the 70s or the 80s, that was your first exposure to any of this shit, really. And so I would never argue that. I think people would probably say that if they were older at that time. But yeah, X2, when it came out, like, it made a case for sure. It once again was in the top 10 films of that year. 10 was Bad Boys 2, 9 was X2, 8 was The Matrix Revolutions, 7 was Terminator 3 Rise of the Machines, 6 was The Last Samurai, 5 was Bruce Almighty, 4 Pirates of the Caribbean, The Curse of the Black Pearl, 3 was The Matrix Reloaded, 2 was Finding Nemo, and 1 was The Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King. So I think to what we were talking about earlier, things are starting to change here. There's still a mixture of star-driven films in this list. Bruce Almighty, that's all Jim Carrey. The Last Samurai, that's all Tom Cruise. Really, Terminator is still kind of all Arnold Schwarzenegger. He's still like a huge name at that point. But now, like, other things are coming into play. Fantasy, Pirates of the Caribbean, Lord of the Rings, sequels, the Matrix movies, big supercharged Disney Pixar films. Finding Nemo had a huge year. So in just 3 short years, we're already starting to see how things are like actively changing at the box office and becoming a little bit more based on franchise models and these things that can be spun out into multiple sequels and multiple other opportunities even outside of the films. And so I think it's really, really interesting. But let's talk about the film itself, though, man. I mean, let's just start off in the place that we have to start off in, the opening sequence. Like, the opening sequence just like kind of changed everything for everybody. If you were a young boy at that time and you saw Nightcrawler and that scene in the White House, it was like, yo, I didn't even know we could do this. And it's funny rewatching it in hindsight because the sequence isn't that long. Like, it doesn't take a long time. It's like a couple of minutes, but the way that they brought it to life, the CGI, the seamlessness of his powers, and just like the mystery of it and how different it looked compared to the first movie, I think it just like instantly took us to a new place that automatically like opened up the doors for what was possible in a superhero movie at that point.
Yeah, you gotta remember me. I'm coming off like X-Men Evolution like ends at the beginning of 2003, I think. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
Like,
that's true.
and so again, bro, Nightcrawler is one of my favorite X-Men. And you telling me I went into this movie theater after watching X-Men Evolution, and one of my favorite X-Men, are not only in the movie because he wasn't in the first one, but he is the beginning and the focal point, and he's doing all this crazy shit in the White House. I was so lit. I remember just being like, "Whoa, what is happening? This is fucking fantastic." Like, I remember just being very excited about what was going on. So yeah, what an opening to a film. I mean, it's a lot of tension. He's using his powers actively. I mean, the CGI looks great. Like, again, we're still coming off, still a lot of CGI to be had, but the way he's disappearing and teleporting around this White House is just different at that time too. It still is good today, of course, right? So think about that time, how we felt. It was a time to be alive, man. What a great opening to a film.
It's funny you mentioned that show. One of the taglines for this movie was "Get ready for the return of the evolution." So they were clearly leaning into
Wow.
that. They knew
I didn't know that.
I know
Yeah.
I didn't remember that either. It was just in the research. They knew that X-Men Evolution was, it was popular, really popular at that time. It was now the second huge
Mhm.
animated series that was on television, and so they leaned into that element. And I think, of course, those Nightcrawler connections. They're like, oh well, we have to obviously speak to that. There's going to be a fan base there that really appreciates what we're doing here. But Stryker is the big villain in this movie. I guess we should talk about him,
Yeah.
played by the
Yeah.
one and only Brian Cox. Fuck off, Brian Cox, man.
He's so good.
He's amazing. I mean,
He's so good.
Brian Cox was already almost 60 at this point. So like he's been around for so long,
That's
such a
crazy to
long
think
time. I
about.
mean, he's been acting for such
Wow.
a long time. But I mean, I remember even seeing this movie. I'm like, I know who that is. I didn't remember his name, but I'm like, I've seen him
Hmm.
before and stuff. He's been in a lot of different things, and he's of course had just an incredible career. But it's funny all these years later now, like in 2023 when Succession ends, that's probably his most famous role. That's probably the role that most people are going to know him for. But like,
Yeah.
if you were around and you watched this movie, a lot of people kind of knew him as the villain in X2. Like, if you didn't see any of his other work, like Brian Cox was William Stryker for a lot of people, and he was obviously exposed to a bigger audience because of his presence in this movie. But yeah, man, how did you feel about just that being like kind of the focal point of the movie? Because there's a lot tied to Wolverine too. I mean, Wolverine spends much of this
Hmm.
movie trying to recollect his past, remember where he comes from, and we know that there's all the experimentation, the Weapon X stuff, and everything that they're leaning into here. But how did this work for you? Just like upon rewatch, seeing Brian Cox, William Stryker be the character that they really focused on here.
In the rewatch, it worked a ton. It was funny because even before the rewatch, though, I didn't even realize how much of a focal point he was. And just realizing how big he was. But in the rewatch, I was like, this dude is a lot of the movie, and it feels like the beginning of thinking about how important Wolverine really is. Of course, we already know pretty main in the first one. Second one, of course, he's doing. But this is like, to me, Stryker helps even propel Wolverine even more into the later movies and what he has to do of a character, man. And one of the most interesting dynamics to me is that moment Stryker and his team, they're attacking the X Mansion, and Bobby and Rogue come back for him. They put up the ice wall. Is Wolverine being sad? Like, I'm what? I'm trying to make amends with my past. Like, and I think that's just such a crazy character moment because it's like trauma bonding, right? In terms of he was literally connected to the dude that did these things to him. And what a cool character, what a cool villain to make somebody feel like that. And I can't remember feeling like that too much before that, of like the main protagonist kind of actively seeking out the antagonist. Usually it's the other way around, right? The antagonist is chasing the other guy. Goblin was trying to whip Spider-Man's ass. This was not technically the case all the way. Wolverine also kind of wanted to see Stryker, and just seeing the way he commanded the room. Right after that ice scene I'm talking about, he blows up the wall, but his whole team is like dipping. He walks in slow motion with his back turned to the bomb. It's just the little things that he was doing. I was like, this dude is a fire actor. And again, I call it cinematic maturity, right? You go back and watch something, you have a different context. just those little things was just like, this dude is fire, dude. Like Brian Cox was really him. And seeing what Stryker meant to Wolverine, it was different. It was a really cool storytelling. And yeah, just a different dynamic for a lot of the superhero films we get. But this dude doesn't have any powers, and he was doing so much in that movie. And you also learn how diabolical he is with his son, and taking, and all of that was just wow. Just Stryker was good. Brian Cox was good.
Yeah, I really only came upon this in recollection. I wasn't thinking about this at this time. I was 11. But this was kind of the first moments where it became clear that like really well respected and well known incredible actors were attaching themselves to superhero movies. Like
Mm-hmm.
it wasn't this medium, it wasn't this genre of filmmaking that only attracted no name actors or inexperienced actors or whatever the case may be. And I mean that's
Right.
always been the case. Like, look, Jack Nicholson was in Batman. He was the
Mm-hmm.
Joker. Jack Nicholson was already at that point even one of the greatest of all time. So they always
Yep.
had that DNA in them, but to do it consistently, to say like, oh yeah, they got Patrick Stewart and they got Ian McKellen and Brian
Mm-hmm.
Cox, like, okay, we're getting some heavy hitter actors here who have done things, who have been in things, who are very well respected, to really bring a lot of life to these characters and to take it seriously, you know. And I think that that's something that's like not often talked about. We talk about it more with the MCU, like, oh, like look at so and so now attaching themselves to this project. It's kind of crazy, right? But even at this point, they were doing it. You know, you can see it on the other side of
Mm-hmm.
town with other movies like a Willem Dafoe and Alfred Molina in the Spider-Man films. Like, again, really well respected, very talented actors, veteran actors, finding
Yeah.
finding the nuance and finding the interesting angles to these characters and saying like, yeah, it can be perceived as a silly comic book character, but there's a lot underneath there. There's a lot to the character of Stryker if you really know how to bring
Mm-hmm.
it to life and you get an actor who can illustrate all of those things and make it really legible for the audience. And so I really took note of that, just like rewatching this movie over the years, that they were very much putting a lot of thought and attention into who could, you know, do this and do it well. We should also mention like who has a big presence in this movie. It's Iceman and Pyro. They become big characters here,
Yeah.
you know. So
Mm-hmm.
Sean Ashmore, he is in the first one, but very, very minimal. He's not a huge
Mm-hmm.
presence in that first movie, but here they really lean into Iceman and Pyro, and they start to develop that friendly rivalry that they would like take shape in the third one. But these were also like two popular characters too. I know you've been calling for Iceman for a while now since we've been talking about X-Men '97, but they had a little bit of a teen angsty vibe here, you know, these two, you know, sort
Mm-hmm.
of just like friendly banter, small, you know, rivalry with each other, but also, you know, they had opportunities to showcase their powers. You talked about a couple with Iceman. One of the big scenes in this movie that's just fucking badass is Pyro with the police cars outside of the house, and like
Yeah.
how he just blows them all up, and we really get a
Mm-hmm.
better understanding of his powers and how he can manipulate fire. But we also see that rage that's developing underneath, like that instability that would lead him down the path of being more of a villain than a hero. So what do you want to say about just those two and just like their increased importance and how they became more of a factor in this movie?
Yeah, they were. I just like how slow motion it was. I think about X1 where Bobby introduces himself to Rogue and he makes the ice flower. And by the way, I don't know how you can compete. Like that's just like an automatic cool ass move. I mean, he probably does it to all the girls. By the way, he probably gives all the girls ice flowers. He definitely
Probably
seemed like the high school jock kind of, but he's probably a dick. But also, he really wasn't that much of a dick to Rogue
a
until
reform dick,
X3,
maybe,
I guess.
maybe.
Yeah, maybe that's what it was. Maybe that's what it was. But yeah, it was really cool. I think seeing both of their presence move throughout time, and the way Pyro, like the way he just came about, the way slow motion that he kept seeing things and being like, I don't like the way this is going down. Because even in the scene that you're talking about, Pyro was like, skip all this stuff. I'm about to blow up these police cars. Which, by the way, Bobby's brother Ronnie calling the cops is what a snitch ass move, bro.
Terrible move, terrible move.
In the rewatch, it made me so mad. Like, you are the worst brother like ever. Like, I would expect that even maybe from the parents, but not from the brother to do that. I was like, oh, this cannot be serious. But yeah, he put them in like a hands up, don't shoot moment, low key. Like, Wolverine was he was like, can you please put away the knives? He's
Oh
like,
my
bro, these are
God.
part of my body, dog. Like, what are you saying to me right now? Like that was insane. But yeah, man, I just like seeing I think those parallels between Pyro and Iceman, but also seeing how Magneto was slowly manipulating Pyro to take him away, but why Bobby kind of maintained the X-Men trajectory. It was very subtle, you know. They didn't have like some super storyline, but the fact they were there at Bobby's house at all was kind of surprising me. I was like, oh shoot, they're at Iceman's house. This isn't a normal thing. They actually have taken time to somewhat explore another character's story. So yeah, they did some things with Iceman and Pyro, man. I enjoyed it.
Related tangent here. You remember Sean Ashmore appearing in The Boys as
Yeah,
Lamplighter? And
Lamplighter. Yep.
him himself having fire-based powers. I think that was season
Cool
2
callback.
that they did that. That was dope. I like that a lot. Man, this movie, also just watching it had a couple of moments where I was like, yeah, this is aged like milk. Like, this very much feels like 2003, which is weird because the first movie doesn't feel like that. The first movie doesn't really have any
Yeah.
hardcore concrete references where it's like, yo, that's 2000 as fuck. Like, I clearly see what year it is. However, this movie, it's like they took a backward step. Like, there's that moment in the mansion where, you know, Wolverine's kind of grilling Iceman about his relationship with Rogue, and he goes in the freezer and grabs a bottled Dr. Pepper, and I'm just like, are people drinking Dr. Pepper anymore? Like, is that a thing?
In a glass bottle.
In a glass bottle at that. Like, if I'm associating any soda in a glass bottle, it's a Coke, not a Dr. Pepper. And then Iceman freezes it. Cheesy, corny, but it is what it is. There's also that moment in the car where Bye 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 by NSYNC plays.
Bro,
where did that come from?
Before they even get to that point, bro, he jumpstarts the car by stabbing it with his claw. What does that mean? Like, how is that possible? He takes out his middle claw and stabs the steering wheel, and the car just starts.
Oh,
is that supposed to be believable? Am I supposed to just say, yeah, he stabbed the steering wheel and the car started? That made no sense to me.
He figured out the push to start. You know,
that's what it was.
It took us like another 10 years. He figured out push to start. That's all it was. That was strange, very strange, but. Yeah, they had some moments here. I mean, even, you know, all throughout these movies, there's like certain lines of dialogue. I'm like, ooh, that's corny as fuck. Like, who wrote that? Like, they are funny, but you also like, yeah, we didn't have a great handle on, you know, saying things that weren't a little bit too cheesy at that particular point. Couple of quick trivia here. The role that Rogue plays in the movies, you know, that of the young mutant who becomes a surrogate, you know, sort of little sister to Wolverine and a friend, that was originally, you know, sort of established in the comics by Kitty Pryde and Jubilee, you know, so they sort of like took an amalgamation of those two characters and gave that to Rogue because they hadn't.
The other ones they start the story with.
Also true. Yes, exactly. And they hadn't really properly introduced Kitty Pryde. I think she has a cameo in this movie technically at some point, but it's not from Elliot Page. It's a different actor, somebody, which, you know, is also interesting at this time too. Like, they had no problems recasting people. I noticed that a lot. Like, people just got swapped in and out all the time for multiple things. That was just kind of a commonplace thing where it's like, oh, so and so's not coming back, or we need somebody more interesting. Like, let's just, you know, replace them. Another interesting thing, you know, there's never really any indication in this movie that Mystique is Nightcrawler's mother, you know, which we know to be the case, you know, based on the comics, but they never really lean into that at all, which is interesting.
There's even a moment where Nightcrawler saves Rogue, and in my rewatch, I'm like, what's going on here? Because, you know, they're supposed to be brother and sister, and I was like, oh, they're not going to do anything with this. Again, this is coming off Evolution, which that's where I learned that whole storyline for real. Like, of course, it wasn't the original, right? With Rogue and her mother and all that stuff, but Evolution was like, no, this is a huge plot point. And so I think I probably at that time even expected a little bit more from some of those moments. Like, y'all don't see this blue lady and this blue dude on this screen right now. What are we doing? So yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, totally. Jean Grey also, like, in speaking to like powers, you know, some of the other trivia here, she can levitate, you know, in the comics, but they never really depict that in the movies at all. We never really see that ability of her to be able to levitate. And you also kind of called this out earlier, Rogue's powers, you know, we know in the comics, she has superhuman strength and speed and all of these different abilities because she absorbs a lot of Captain Marvel's powers, but we never see any inkling of that in any of these movies. I mean, she's just like she's just she's not getting dick at the end of the day because she can't fuck her
Yeah,
boyfriend. She can't touch her boyfriend. So she wants to have
can't
that
do none
that
of
romantic ability, but yeah, that's not happening for her. But they never give her anything else, which I think is also just like a missed opportunity. And I don't know why they did that. And especially after seeing X-Men 97 recently, where it's like,
hmm
yeah, that's Rogue. Like she's a badass. She can kick ass and she's like really formidable, but they just make her really, really, I guess, restricted here to some extent, and just did more
They
emotional
do.
things with her instead of physical things.
You know, I thought there was a moment where they might get cool, and we haven't talked about The Last Stand yet, but I think this is important to call out right now, where the danger room at the beginning of The Last Stand, Cyclops touches her and she turns metal in order to block something from hitting her.
Mm-hmm.
I thought their idea was to use that more often, where she's like, I need to take your powers to do this. She
Yeah,
she she has to touch Wolverine in order to heal. She has to do this over here from somebody else. I thought they would use that more, because to me, if that's used more often, that's a cool power. Like, oh shoot, I can take whatever you do and just do that. But this didn't use it often enough. So yeah,
yeah.
that's interesting.
And maybe it's just a product of her not being a focal point. Like these are just movies; they're not long form series. They only have but so much time and so much real estate, and they have actively made the choice to focus on Wolverine and Storm and Charles and Magneto and da 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 da. And so it might have just been a product of timing and not having enough time to like really unpack that, because that could have been a nice thing to give our character to utilize more. But in
hmm
speaking about that, you mentioned this earlier, just the I guess the sophistication or lack thereof in comic book movie action and how far we've really come over the years. Because at this time, these movies, the fight choreography, the action, it's not all that great. It's cool, it's fine, but I
It's
think
not
the
great.
best example of what they could have done here and what they achieved is probably the scene between Wolverine and Lady Deathstrike. That fight,
Yeah.
pretty
hmm
badass. Like, could have even had more of it, could have gone longer, but that was kind of like the best example of like, oh wow, this is like great fight choreography. They have similar powers, obviously, and what's working now, similar weapons that they're using. But
Yeah.
also like a lot of the other scenes that we see throughout the course of this movie, the previous one, and X3, it's just like, we just hadn't quite made it to the point of like being able to just showcase this over the top, big, bombastic action to a significant degree just yet. Things were a little, I guess, just a little restricted just due to the timing of where things were, or maybe just not even having the vision to understand how to communicate and execute some of these powers. Because some of the stuff, it's still like you're figuring out as you go. Like a lot of this, I never done this before. Like how do we have a CGI ice character? We had never really done that before. How do we
hmm
display all this stuff? So yeah, any thoughts on just like that, and even the fight itself again between Deathstrike and Wolverine in the movie?
Yeah, Deathstrike and Wolverine was a cool fight. Not only that, it was hella dark the way it ended. He literally pumped her body with
Super
adamantium. I
violent.
was
Yeah.
like, whoa. That's one thing about these movies I did want to call out is they're hella violent. Like people be like, there's not a ton of blood, but people be like dying. Like the way they die is
Yeah,
insane.
the
Like, did
implied
we?
violence of what you
Yeah,
yeah.
like y'all offed these people over here. And a lot of the best fight scenes in a lot of these movies are Mystique. To be honest, Mystique is like she's like going crazy all the time when she infiltrates Striker's place to figure out where whatchamacallit was. What was it? The end. Oh yeah, it was the end. When she's trying to get in to find where Cerebro was, I think.
Oh, yeah,
And
yeah.
she's like, yeah, that all of that stuff is crazy, man. Or even one of the best parts of the movie, because it's nerdy as hell, where she tricks oh boy into the bathroom, puts iron in his blood. He goes to work
Yep.
because he's guarding Magneto, and Magneto takes the iron out of his blood in order to escape the plastic prison. Did you hear what I just said? That is like the nerdiest thing I like I had ever seen. But yeah, it's like moments like that were like almost cooler even than some of the other choreography things. Like Magneto, that whole Magneto thing, it's just violent, bro. Like you could literally see all the iron leaving the dude's body, and then him using that iron to attack other people. It was just, that's like some of the stuff that was even more than the choreography that was going on. But that fight with Yuriko or Lady Deathstrike and Wolverine, man, yeah, that's where it was at. And other than that, it was probably Mystique bringing a lot of the best fight scenes to the movie.
Yeah. Ultimately, the biggest thing we were missing was not even just the action itself, or maybe some of the underwhelming scenes that we might have seen. Because at the time they felt fine. We didn't have really any context. Again, that's important to remember. But now looking back on it, it's like, yeah, we've grown a lot. But there wasn't much of the team dynamic of like mutants working together. Like, how can we see their powers leveraged
Exactly.
off of one another? Which, you know, we praised a lot of that in X-Men 97. Just the
That's why I
teamwork.
called
You
it
know, it
out.
was just like
Yep.
amazing to see so and so use their powers in addition to so and so, and like how they can combine those things. And I mean, honestly, in live action, we hadn't really saw it effectively done until the Avengers. You know, that was really
Yeah.
the first time. And it's like, it's
Yep.
interesting because we had so many X-Men movies already at that point where it's like, damn, y'all had like 7 chances to do like great team action and you just never did it. It took the
They
Avengers,
never
but
did.
you know, it was just
They
a different era, you know, ultimately.
yeah,
So
they thought X3 was it.
they tried, they really
They thought
tried.
X3 was
Yeah.
it. Wolverine just gets tossed a couple times. That's it. That was like the whole. That's the whole team.
No, for sure. We're gonna move on to X3 in a second. I guess just the last big thing is like the ending. You know, Jean Grey sacrifice. That was a huge moment of the movie. We talked about it, the secret, the fact that it was like her sacrificing herself. It implied that she was dying, you know, or that she died in this movie. We know that that wasn't the case, and I think even like being skeptical at the time, like she's not really dead. We know what they're doing because she was already having premonitions in this movie. They were already sort of signaling that they were going to do something with the
Right.
Dark Phoenix saga. But do you remember like how you felt in the moment, like when you saw it the first time, like just seeing a character like that seemingly die on screen? Because I mean, she was one of the primary leads. She was a big character, and it was kind of a big moment for her. And we obviously see like it affected Cyclops. He was super emotional about it, as we would expect him to be. They placed a lot of emotional emphasis on it because it really concluded the movie almost, not entirely, but almost on a cliffhanger. It almost like kind of left you thinking like, oh well, there's gonna be another one. You have to come back to see
Yeah.
like what's the ultimate fate of Jean Grey in the third entry.
Yeah, I remember kind of being sad about it actually.
Yeah, same,
Thinking,
same, yeah.
yeah, I remember being like, "Dang, they didn't kill Jean," because there has been enough time passed at this time for you to actually love the characters that are around, right? Like you now have a relationship with Wolverine. You now have a relationship with Storm and Professor and the Professor and Jean. And it was, I remember her, and it was such a noble sacrifice at the time. Like there was that big rush of water, and even before she kind of does her superheroics, there is like Stryker tied to the dam, which again, another crazy ass violent death. I'm telling, bro, the deaths in this, it was one more I got to call out. There was like a moment where Magneto walks in and just pulls the pins out of everyone's grenades.
Oh man,
And
yeah.
I'm just like,
It was so
what is
nonchalantly
this
done.
violence?
Yeah, it was crazy.
This violence is insane. But you see Stryker die right before that, and you're like, whoa. It's not really about, I guess, his death, but it's about like the how dangerous this water is. You know what I mean? Like how dangerous this dam is coming at the team, and the jet not being able to move the way it needs to move. And then there's just a moment where it's like, where's Jean? And Professor goes, she's outside. And the way he says it was like, what do you mean she's outside? Like he says it kind of calm, like he knew what was happening almost. Like she's outside. And yeah, after, just all of it, they made it really dramatic. I like the music, and she's holding everything. Oh, Nightcrawler's like, she's stopping me from going out there to get her. It was just, they did a good job, I think, of ramping it up to make you feel sad by the time she dies, you know. And of course her and Wolverine had the whole kissing moment earlier in the film, and it's just like, dang, y'all didn't let Jean die. And I think even at that time, I hadn't revisited a lot of the Dark Phoenix story. I knew who she was, but I don't think I thought in my head, I just didn't know what it looked like for her to come back, I guess. You know what I mean? Like I didn't know what that meant. And so yeah, just seeing her die was sad, man. It was sad. I didn't think she'd go out like that.
Yeah, I mean, especially because that the origin of the Phoenix Force, in addition to Jean, it's drastically different, you know, than
It's
how,
way
it's
different.
way different.
Yeah.
You know, there's a cosmic element, all that stuff. So yeah, I mean, it was effective. I think that they did a great job, you know, just conveying the emotion of the scene, just the weight of it and everything, and to get you really really invested in her and her outcome, and obviously how it was going to affect the rest of the team. So it was a really really strong ending. I know Bryan Singer, you know, his inspirations for this movie were The Empire Strikes Back and The Wrath of Khan, you know, in terms of sequels and making you become super invested, but also like walking away not truly with a sense of like a victory, like something had been significantly lost in order to like progress the fight, and they definitely lost here. So I think he nailed it. He nailed it for sure.